Hi, I'm josephrlewis and I write adventures. And today I want to talk about the idea of writing system-neutral adventures. When I first started writing adventures, they were pretty much all for 5e because that was the only system that I knew. But as I began writing for more systems, because I was playing more games, I was confronted with the question of how I would design or format my adventures for those different systems. And at first, the obvious solution was to make multiple versions of each adventure. So there'd be one for 5e and one at the time for OSR. And the early format that I was using for OSR was kind of a system neutral. It was when we used simple stats like armor as chain. And I liked that a lot. It was very simple because I personally find it kind of a chore to try to shove cool adventure ideas into the specific rules of any given system. And also, I personally really don't like writing long stat blocks. But eventually I stopped using that system neutral OSR style and I started using the OSE, Old School Essentials stat block system, because that seemed broadly applicable to a lot of the BX style retro clones, and that seemed like a good idea at the time. And I also started adding Cairn stat blocks as well, so I was backed up to 3 systems. But as time went on, I realized I really didn't have much interest in 5e. I wasn't playing it, I wasn't running it anymore, and I wasn't getting a lot of feedback that indicated that 5e players were playing my adventures, so I let that fall by the wayside. And leaving out 5e stat blocks saved me a ton of page space. So then I was back down to 2 styles, 2 systems, OSC and Cairn. But then over the past year, I've added in Shadow Dark, so I'm back up to 3 systems. But now, instead of making 3 different versions of a given adventure for each of those different systems, I've been creating one version, one document, that contains 3 different bestiaries, back to back, and individual GM guide notes for each of those systems. So a page describing to each GM how to adjudicate different systems or different situations, which die to roll for traps, how much to value for treasure, and I put that all together in one version of the document. So everyone would have 3 different setups for how to run the adventure. And this system is okay. It's not elegant, but it does work, I think. My goal whenever I write any adventure is to create content that any interested GM can pick up and run with as easily as possible. But also, I personally don't want to write 3 or more whole versions of every adventure to cater to every popular system of the day. I don't love having to recreate bestiaries over and over again. I don't like combing through and trying to figure out how all the traps should work in every different system. That's a lot of extra work for me. So how do I support all the GMs as best as possible while also not creating a ton of extra work for myself? That's kind of the challenge. One idea that I tried out in the Wicked Little Delves adventure series that I put out was to write adventures or dungeons that only had one monster in each dungeon. So each adventure only needed one stat block. So if I wanted to cater to 3 systems, I only needed to make basically 3 stat blocks for each adventure, and that lightened the work on me a lot. And I think the adventures turned out pretty well. So if you've ever run the Wicked Little Delves, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how that setup and design worked down in the comments below. Another concept idea that I tried out in the Perilous Path of the Cursed Camel was to use a few generic stat blocks like Swarm or Fighter, so that a complete bestiary could fit on just a single page. So if I wanted to have 3 different bestiaries, again, it was just 3 pages of content, not a lot. And then in each adventure scenario, I could have lots of different creatures, but they would all reuse the same stat block. So a zombie or a bandit or a goblin might all just use the fighter stat block. So that way I could have tons of creatures in tons of systems and only have 3 pages dedicated to the housekeeping and management of the stats. If you've ever run or played Perilous Path of the Cursed Camel, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how that system worked for you down in the comments below. For my future adventures, I'm going to keep playing with all of these techniques with the same kind of goals in mind. I want to keep the bestiaries small and focused. I want to reuse stat blocks wherever it makes sense. I want to try to avoid single-use stat blocks. That tends to be bosses, but there could also be one-off creatures, and maybe there's a different or better way to do that or manage those creatures. I also want to think very hard about whether an encounter with some kind of creature is really a monster stat block situation, or some other kind of trap or challenge. For example, a lot of game systems have something called strangling vines, a monster called a strangling vine, which has hit points and you hit it and it attacks. But does that creature need to be a monster with a stat block, or can that just be an environmental hazard that you roll normal checks and saves to escape from. I don't know. Maybe that's a better way to handle those kinds of situations and then reduce the number of monster stat blocks that we have to deal with. I think in general, my goal would be to try to keep any bestiary to a 2-page spread. So that way it's easier for me to create, but also it's a lot lighter lift for the GM to manage at the table. They only have to look at this one spread. They don't have to go flipping back and forth between a lot of pages. And I think that's helpful for everyone. But there's more to managing systems in your adventures than just the monster stats and the bestiaries. For example, environmental hazards like traps can be handled differently in different systems. And my personal approach to these things is to describe the trap or the hazard to the GM in very natural sounding language. So a trap might be a hidden pressure plate on the floor shoots a spear out of the wall next to it. That way, I don't want to inject a lot of math or mechanics around how do you find it, how do you disarm it, how do you avoid it. I think if you describe it in natural terms, the GM will understand what's happening, the players will understand what's happening, and they should know their system well enough to know what checks or saves or whatever it may be may need to be invoked in order to manage or get around that hazard. That way, the only thing I need to describe is probably how much damage it does. So then I just need to think about how tough are PCs in each given system at whatever level I think I'm writing for. So maybe in Shadowdark, the trap only does 1d4 damage, while in Cairn, maybe it does 1d6. Easy enough. As writers, we also need to think about rewards. So if the PCs find a pile of 10 rubies in Shadowdark, these might be worth 100 gold pieces and 1 XP. But if those same PCs find a pile of 10 rubies in Old School Essentials, then maybe those are worth 5,000 gold pieces and 5,000 XP. It's an important distinction. So my trick that I'm trying to manage in a system neutral or system agnostic way is instead of doling out gold coins, which have very specific amounts and values and meanings in different systems, I like to use gems and trinkets. So that way in the adventure text, we can say you find 10 rubies or you find 1 gold necklace, and you don't give a value. But then in the notes to the GM, on those GM-specific pages, I can say, in this system, a ruby is worth this much XP for you. And in this system over here, it's worth this much for you. But it's still in the adventure text, just a ruby. And I think that's easy and accessible and makes sense to a lot of folks. But what about tools and weapons and magic items? Those could be extremely different and specific in different gaming systems. So 5th edition, for example, might want you to define a spell's radius and range and casting time, casting requirements, the effects that happen against objects, the effects that happen against creatures or creatures of different types. There's a lot of detail that can go into that. But we can get around all of those mechanics for all those different systems by creating bespoke magical items instead of using ones that are out of the book, that function using, again, plain, simple, straightforward language. And my favorite example of this is something I created a very long time ago, which was the Master Shovel. And the description simply states that the Master Shovel digs a standard grave in 1 scoop. Very simple. I don't need to describe how big a grave is or how long a scoop takes. Those are very natural words that everyone, the GM, and the players will understand. In the RPG space, we are living in interesting times. It seems like every year more and more game systems are published, and many of them are very good and interesting and cool. And take off and find their audiences, which is fantastic. But also, many of them are pretty similar in a lot of ways, or they overlap in content or genre. And while it's great that we have so many different games and very specific GMs and their tables and their friends can find the game that really speaks to them, that they really enjoy, it's creating more and more challenges for us adventure writers to create content. Because if we write for a very niche specific game, then maybe we're excluding everyone else. And if we try to write for everyone, then we're creating work for the GMs who have to then convert our content into their systems. So this is a challenge for us. This is what we have to grapple with. On the one hand, I really want to support creators and their systems and their new products. I think they're very cool, and I want to be a part of that. And I know that systems really thrive on having adventure content. It's not enough to publish a book of rules if there's nothing to play on it. So I want to support those guys, and I want to give them content. But that also challenges me to write my content in their system or in a way that's accessible to their system. I don't have a perfect solution to this challenge. I just wanted in this video to talk about some of the facets of this problem, what it looks like to me and what I've been thinking about lately, what I've been experimenting with in some of my recent publications to try to help everyone or support everyone or everyone that's close enough to the space I'm writing in, the kinds of adventures that I write. But I'd really love to hear from you guys about what you've been doing or what you've been thinking about this problem. What do you want to see in adventures? Do you think they should be very specific to their systems? Do you think there's a lingua franca that we could be using that's system agnostic but still helpful, that doesn't put a lot of work on the GM to convert content from one system to another? What have you tried? What have you used? What have you liked? I'd love to hear from all you guys in the comments today. I think this is an important subject that's going to keep growing as our hobby keeps growing and as the number of published systems keeps growing, which is a good problem to have, but I do think we need to think seriously about the best way forward and how we can tackle that. And I think that's about all I have for right now, so good luck out there.